And while some were speaking of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings, he said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And they asked him, "Teacher, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place?" And he said, "See that you are not led astray. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and the time is at hand. Do not go after them. And when you hear of wars and tumults, do not be terrified, for these things must first take place, but the end will not be at once." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes, and in various places famines and pestilences. There will be terrors and great signs from heaven. But before all of this, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. This will be your opportunity to bear witness. Settle it, therefore, in your minds not to meditate beforehand how to answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be delivered up even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and some of you they will put to death. You will be hated by all for my name's sake, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your lives. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter it. For these are the days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. Alas for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days. For there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among the nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And there will be signs in the sun and moon and stars, and on the earth great distress of nations in perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves, people fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is coming on the world. For the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to take place, straighten up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." And he told them a parable. "Look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they come out in leaf, you see for yourselves and know that the summer is already near. So also when you see these things taking place, you will know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all this has taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." The gospel of our Lord. This morning, I want to draw your attention to our gospel reading here from Luke, the end of Luke 20 and the beginning, in the main part of Luke 21. And this chapter, along with its counterpart, or in the synoptics, especially in Matthew 24, and known as the Olivet Discourse, is maybe in the modern American church one of the most misunderstood, passages. And it's actually to the point where it's almost hard to preach on it sometimes, because I believe that if you actually preach what the text is saying, many in the church will automatically think you're some kind of liberal. Because the way that most people read this is that this is something that's in our future. This is about the second coming of Christ and the events leading up to them. This is about the end of history. And I'm going to be making the case that this has already all taken place. This is about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. But again, these texts have become so wrapped up in a certain way of viewing the end times that for a lot of people, if anyone questions it, they automatically think, well, you must not take the Bible seriously. You must not really believe the Bible. But I do have to say that in the popular position in American Christianity, known as dispensational premillennialism, has only been around for 100 years. No one in the history of the church quite believed the same things that, or is popular believed today. There's people that were known as premillennialists, but they're not of the stripe that we have today. So all of that just is kind of a preface to looking at what this text is actually about. This text is about a coming judgment that Jesus predicts, and it's a judgment on Jerusalem. It is a judgment on the people of God that will simultaneously be a judgment for them, and it will be salvation, for the early church. Jesus says this very thing. Notice in verse 28, now when these things begin to take place, straighten up and raise your head, because your redemption is drawing near. And redemption from what? Well, Jesus has said, that all of this persecution that they're going to go through. He says some of you are going to be killed. And it's going to be your fathers and your mothers that do this. But in order to really understand it, we have to look at the context of all of this. What is Jesus out all those people? The sacrifices stop. Like action. Jesus just had prophesied, this place is going to be surrounded by armies. And what Jesus does is he goes and shuts the temple down. And when he quotes Jeremiah, when he calls it a den of thieves, Jeremiah says that in the context of Israel, thinking that they could go out and do whatever they wanted, that they could disobey God, that they could live in rebellion against him, and that they would come back to the temple and say, we're safe, we're saved, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. And that's the context in which God, prophesying through Jeremiah, says, has this house that is called by my name become a den of robbers in your eyes, a den of thieves? And notice that the den of thieves is not the place they do their thieving. It's the place they go to afterwards. It's their safe house. That's the den. And that's what the temple had become to Israel. He says, will you go off and lie and cheat and steal and murder and then come back to this place and say you're delivered? And that's in the context of Jeremiah, God saying, this place is going to be destroyed and you're going to be carried off, to the nations. You're going to be taken captive in Babylon. And so when Jesus quotes that, as he drives everyone out of the temple, people would have known what Jesus is saying. He's saying, you're just like the people in Jeremiah's day. And just like it happened to them, it's going to happen to you. This place is going to be torn down, in the nation, you're going to be carried off, into exile. You're going to be taken captive. And then Jesus, it's in this same context here that Jesus begins, to give a number of parables that we hear about this. For example, the parable of the vineyard owner. This owner of this vineyard who lets out his vineyard to these tenants. And where he starts sending them servants to collect the rent, and they beat them until he finally sends his son to them and saying, well, surely they won't do this to my son. And when the people see these people that are renting out the vineyard, which is Israel, when they see the son coming, they say, here's the heir, let's kill him. And Jesus even says in that parable, what will the owner of the vineyard do to them? And they say, he's going to come with an army and he'll kill those miserable wretches. And Jesus says, and so the kingdom shall be taken away from you and given to people who will pay him, the fruit of the kingdom. And it's in this context, that Jesus And here in our text, as it starts today, I expanded the text a little bit from the lectionary so we can have this context. Jesus begins, or it's the lectionary we had last week about the resurrection, putting their gifts into the offering box. And he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, truly, I tell you, this widow has put in more than all of them, for they all contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had to live on. This text is often referenced to people as if Jesus is praising this, as if this widow is this great example. Jesus is not happy about this. And I think this comes out even more in Matthew's gospel. He's witnessing the devouring of widows' houses right in front of him. Here, this woman is left penniless. Jesus isn't happy about the fact that she has no money now to live on. And it's all going into keeping the temple running. And it's right then that the disciples look around and they're seeing all the great buildings of the temple. And it says, and while some were speaking of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings, he said, as for these things that you see, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Jesus says, you see all these great buildings? They're all getting torn down. There's not going to be left here one stone upon another. Jesus is predicting the destruction of Jerusalem. He's predicting the destruction of the temple. This whole system, that's built on devouring widows' houses and run by people that are in rebellion against him. And it's in this context that the disciples then ask him, and they asked him, teacher, when will these things be? And what will be the sign these things are about to take place? So notice they ask him 2 questions. And the questions are about the destruction of Jerusalem that he just prophesied. They say, when will this thing take place? What's the time frame? And what are the signs that will know it's going to happen? That's the question that Jesus asked. Notice that they don't ask him, when will the end of the world be? They don't say, Jesus, when are you going to come again? At this point, the disciples don't even know about the second coming. That's so far off their radar, they don't understand what's going on. All they know is that they just heard Jesus say that the temple was going to be destroyed, and they want to know when that's going to happen. And those are the exact 2 questions that Jesus answers in what he goes on to say. Notice, and he answers them in one sense in reverse order. First, he begins to tell them all about the signs that this is going to take place, and then he tells them when it's going to take place. He gives them a time frame, not a definite time frame, but let's start there. He gives them this parable. After he gives them all these signs, he says, and then he told them a parable. Look at the fig tree in place already. They would think, you don't believe the Bible. You must be some kind of liberal. I'm like, well, no. Jesus says that generation won't pass away until all of this has taken place. I think that really is true. And again, we know that in AD 70, the armies of Rome under Vespasian, came and surrounded Jerusalem, and it was terrible what happened. And we'll see this in a few weeks in the beginning of Advent, the readings from the latter part of Matthew 24, where Jesus talks about there'll be 2 people at a well. One will be taken, one will be left. And people think that that's somehow about the rapture. No, Jesus is saying half of you are going to die. Half of Jerusalem is going to die in this siege. And again, we know that that took place. But what is important here is that that coming judgment is a judgment on Israel, but it is not a judgment on the church. So what Jesus is doing in this text is he's telling the church what they need to know to escape the coming judgment that is not for them. Right? They're going to go through a time of persecution. And again, Jesus says this to them. There in the first century, he says, right, what's going to happen to them? And we know that this happened in the early church. He says, right, that they're going to lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. You will be brought before kings and governors for my sake. Again, this is not about the church right now. The church right now, it's not going to be brought before the synagogues. This is exactly what was going on in the first century. And Jesus is saying, you will be delivered up even by parents and brothers and relatives. And some of you they will put to death. You will be hated by all for my name's sake. He's saying, listen, before this is coming, before the destruction of Jerusalem, right, the biggest persecutor of the church were the Jews. Or this is what we saw when we were looking in James' epistle. Or this is the situation in the first century, and it's what we read of in the book of Acts. Right, ultimately, right, Paul, right, who formerly Saul persecuting the church, then Paul is being chased around, right, to have people chasing him to foreign cities. And it's right, the story of him coming back and being right, ultimately imprisoned. And he had to be imprisoned to save him from the plots of the Jews against him. Right? This is what Jesus is talking about. And he says this is all going to take place. But notice what Jesus says. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that the desolation has come near. And Jesus is telling them, once you see, right, you're going to hear of all these different things. In fact, one of the words that he used here, and you will hear of wars and tumults. That word tumults really means something like insurrection. You're going to hear of wars. You're going to hear of the insurrections that are happening. Right, that's part of it. And if you were in Israel, you would have. Because this is exactly what took place. There was an insurrection against Rome. There was all this judgment. And it also doesn't make a difference, right, for someone like a pregnant woman and those nursing an infant. What does that matter if we're talking about the end of history? That makes perfect sense, though, if we're talking about fleeing Jerusalem ahead of an army coming. Right, then it really would be hard, for example, if someone was, right, pregnant. Right, that's going to make it, that journey, that fleeing away, way more difficult because we're dealing here with a localized judgment in Jerusalem. Right, this is something that is, again, that Jesus is telling the church that they can escape from. And notice this, that in history, we learn that this really did happen. That the Christians got out of Rome. Or sorry, not of Rome. They got out of Jerusalem right before the arrival of Rome. And again, from the very beginning, the church knew, right, that judgment on Jerusalem was coming. And this is why, right, in the early church too, they were selling their property, right, in Israel. They were selling their property in Jerusalem and bringing it to, right, the church because they knew that Jesus had been predicting the coming destruction of Israel, or the coming destruction of Jerusalem. And that's no longer the place you want to keep all your money in either. All right, so sell it while you can. And this is the way that the Christians lived. And then they fled Jerusalem right before the armies of Rome, because this had been something that was known in the church that this was going to take place. And again, I want to end with this. This is something, right? The judgment of God is something that is simultaneously, right, a judgment on the wicked and redemption for God's people. And that's still the case. That didn't change right from the first century, or even when we look ultimately to the second coming of Christ. Right, that will be a day that is both judgment and deliverance. And this is the way God's judgments always work, right? Because and again here, it's that, right, the church was being persecuted. When the church is then, right, freed from that persecution, is simultaneous with, right, God judging their persecutors. And so Christians, again, this is one of these texts, as I said, that's very misunderstood because people almost automatically assume that this is about something in the future, something far off, something that we should be looking for. Of when we hear of wars and rumors of wars and all this, right, this judgment that is coming. But again, that's not the context that Jesus is giving it in. Jesus has been, since he's entered Jerusalem, he's been talking about this coming judgment on Jerusalem, how it's going to be surrounded by armies. The temple's going to be shut down. It's going to happen to Israel in his day, just like it did in the days of Jeremiah, when the Babylonians came under Nebuchadnezzar and destroyed Jerusalem and carried, right, Judah captive into Babylon. And Jesus is saying that's all coming. And as they're in the temple, the disciples are, right, looking at all the great buildings around, and Jesus says this is all coming down. And what Jesus is doing here is answering that question, when will these things be? What are the signs that they're going to be fulfilled?